Hi boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about special types of stories. We're going to talk about fairy tales. And you're going to look and listen to a fairy tale later today called Cinderella. And we're going to practice identifying the character, the setting, the problem, and the solution. But don't worry, I will help you learn that. But for now, I wanted to talk about a couple components that fairy tales have, which means things that you see over and over again when you read fairy tale stories. Often you will hear a fairy tale start with once upon a time. That's a big clue that it's going to be a fairy tale. And the stories are make-believe. They are not real stories. They are make-believe stories. Another big clue that it might be a fairy tale is if it ends with happily ever after. So if you hear once upon a time, happily ever after, it's probably a fairy tale. Other things fairy tales often have in them are royalty, which means there's probably a princess, maybe a prince. That's why Mrs. McMahon drew a big crown here. There's usually royalty in a fairy tale. There's often magic too. You'll have magical characters, maybe talking animals, things that are magic in the story. There's also these guys. There's usually a good character and an evil character. So a character who does good things and a character who does not so good things. There will also often be love, maybe between the prince and princess. Not sure, but there'll be love usually in a fairy tale. And sometimes you'll see 3 things or repetitions of 3 or number 7 in fairy tales. It's just a common thing. We'll talk more about them when we see them. But for today, I wanted to show you this big book that I have. This is called A Treasury of Fairy Tales. Later on in the school year, we will each write our own fairy tale, and we will make our own treasury of fairy tales to share with everyone. It's a very special part of our kindergarten program. And at the end of the school year, we will have a fairy tale ball where you will get to dress up as maybe royalty, if you like, as we end our school year. So I'm going to practice with you this morning. I'm going to quickly go through Little Red Riding Hood. That's a fairy tale. As I read, I want you to think, do you hear once upon a time? Is there magic in my story? Do I have talking animals? So be on the lookout and listen for things that might tell us this is a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a little village girl, the prettiest girl you have ever seen. Her mother loved her dearly, as did her grandmother. She had made her a little red hood, which suited her so well that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Your grandmother is not very well. Go and see how she is. You can take her some cookies and this homemade jelly." Little Red Riding Hood left right away to visit her grandmother, who lived in another village. As she was walking through the forest, she met a wolf. He would have liked to gobble her up on the spot, but he did not dare to because there were some woodcutters in the forest. He pretended to be very kind and asked her where she was going. The poor girl did not know that it was dangerous to talk to the wolf, and she said to him, "I'm going to see my grandmother to take her some cookies and a jar of jelly my mother made for her." "Does she live very far away?" asked the wolf. "Oh, yes," replied Little Red Riding Hood. "Her house is beyond the mill, but the first house in the village." "Well," said the wolf, "I would like to see her too. I will take this road here. You take the other road, and we will see who arrives first." It did not take the wolf long to reach the grandmother's house. He knocked at the door. "Who is it?" a voice came from inside. "It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood," said the wolf, disguising his voice. "I have brought you some cookies and a jar of jelly." The good grandmother, who was in bed, called out, "Lift up the latch and come in." The wolf lifted the latch and the door opened. At once he leapt on the bed and gobbled her up. Then the wolf heard a tap tap at the door. "Who is it?" Who is it? Came the gruff wolf's voice. When she heard this, Little Red Riding Hood seemed a little scared at first. But remembering her grandmother was ill, she answered, "It is your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood. I've brought you some cookies and a jar of jelly." The wolf softened his voice this time and called, "Lift up the latch and come in." Little Red Riding Hood lifted the latch and the door opened. The wolf hid under the bed covers and said, "Put the cookies and jar of jelly on the table and come sit on the bed beside me." Little Red Riding Hood climbed onto the bed and stared at her grandmother. "Grandma, what big arms you have," she cried. "All the better to hug you with," the wolf replied. This is a big picture. So you'll see Little Red Riding Hood sitting on the bed next to not her grandmother. That's the wolf dressed up in disguise. "And grandmother, what big ears you have. All the better to hear you with." "Grandma, what big eyes you have. All the better to see you with, my child." "Grandma, what big teeth you have," cried Little Red Riding Hood. "All the better to eat you with," barked the wolf, and he jumped out of the covers, and throwing back the covers, he leapt out of bed. Just as he was about to eat the little girl up, the woodcutters, who had been in the forest, burst into the cottage and saved Little Red Riding Hood. And no one was ever troubled by the tricky wolf ever again. And she lived happily ever after. Okay, so let's give it a try. Our main character is who? Who do you think it could be? Little Red Riding Hood. Mrs. McMahon, I try to draw really good pictures, so I hope that you know what my pictures are. This is my Little Red Riding Hood, and she's our main character. The story is all about her. My setting, the place where our story happened, it was in the woods at Grandma's house. So our character is Little Red Riding Hood. Our setting is in the forest at Grandma's house. And then we have a problem. Who is the big problem? That big bad wolf. And what does he keep doing that's so bad? He keeps gobbling them up. But after our problem, we had a solution. Who saved Little Red Riding Hood? The woodcutters saved her. And they're basically guys who chop down trees. So I gave him this big chopper right here. So they saved her from the big bad wolf. They busted into Grandmom's house and saved her from that big bad wolf gobbling her up. So as you read Cinderella today, be on the lookout for things for fairy tales. Do you hear once upon a time? Is there magic? Is there love? Is there a good or evil character? I can't wait to see your work. Have fun reading fairy tales this week.